remembering what God has done. Remembering what God has done. God realizes that we as human beings, we often forget what he has done for us. In Deuteronomy 6:12, Moses issued a final warning to Israel just before they entered the promised land. Beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The meaning of this Hebrew word for memorial in verse 7 is to remember. Given man's propensity to forget, it is little wonder that memorials have frequently played an important role in biblical history. I want you to consider with me, what kind of memorials do you have in your life? And whether you realize it or not, we all have memorials in our lives that it may not be a monument of stones, but still built up memories. There are memories of places, there are memories of people, there are places that trigger memories, just as the memorial stones did in Gilgal. There are some significant places in your life that elicit memories. But how often do we really sit down and thank God for the people that he's brought into our lives? How often do we thank God for the people that he has used in our lives? There are memories of experiences of God answering prayer. There's memories of God's marvelous hand of provision. I remember in college and even more recently of how God always provided all of my needs. The point is that God knows we can forget. He knows that we need, that we think, and that it's the reason that he instructs Joshua to build a memorial, so that each time the Israelites saw it, they would be reminded that they had not crossed the Jordan of their own ability, of their own strength, but only because of God.
It wasn't long before they did not remember his miracles. Israel, had a lot to remember. God had done so very much for them. By this time, Israel has a long relationship with God that started a man named Abram. And now they've been delivered by Moses from Pharaoh's house of bondage. And Pharaoh changed his mind and decided to get his horses and his chariots and return them to slavery. But God stepped in, and God gave them the victory, and they didn't have to raise their hands to fight in battle. I said they had a lot to remember. They had a lot to remember: the frogs and the lice and the boils and the lightning. They had a lot to remember: the water that was turned to blood and blood turned back to water again. They had a lot to remember: the darkness that covered they had a lot to remember when death angel went through the city and took the firstborn. They had a lot to remember when they didn't have a road map, but they had a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They had a lot to remember when God held back Pharaoh and let them cross dry shod through the Red Sea. But they had malfunctioning memories. They had spiritual amnesia. Wait a minute before we jump on Israel. Is there anybody here that needs to remember what God has done in your life? Is there anybody that God made a way for you, and through the passage of time you've forgotten all about that? Maybe there's somebody in the room that you didn't have that good job that you have right now. You had to wonder where you were going to pay your bills. But somehow or another God paid the bills, and you didn't get put outdoors, and God kept opening a way for you. Somebody ought to have a spiritual scrapbook to keep you from forgetting what God has done in your life. Listen, I've got a testimony that I must never forget. I've got wounds in my physical body where in September 1983, an assailant with a loaded pistol came into the church parsonage, and he came to take my life. I didn't have anything but God and God's awareness. And I said, oh, Jesus, help me. He shot 5 times. One went through my right arm and one lodged in my right thigh. And I will never forget what God has done in my life. Because if it had not been for the Lord, I wouldn't be standing in front of you at this time. Problem is, it didn't take the Israelites very long to forget the works of God. According to the psalmist, it was only a matter of weeks and they forgot. It was only a matter of a few days. Wait a minute, have you been healed? Wait a minute, has God made provision for you? Wait a minute, has God been your protection? Has God been your strength when you were weak? Has God been your enabler? One forgets when you don't rehearse it. If you don't rehearse it, it'll get away from you. If you don't rehearse it and run it through your mind every now and then, it'll get away from you. That's why Moses was charged every year to have a Passover celebration, because God wanted them always to remember, I was the one that brought you out. I was the one that brought you out on eagle's wings. And if we're not careful, we'll soon forget. And I want to remember that I must never deny God. God, you gave me rest last night. God, you kept the enemy away from me. God, you didn't let the telephone ring. God, you didn't let anybody break in on me. God, you kept my wife and my children. I just want to keep it in my mind.
I challenge you today to spend some time thinking through your memorial stones. Let them draw you closer to God and remind you of his faithfulness. As I said again in Deuteronomy 6:12-15, it says, be careful that you do not forget the Lord that brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God, who is among you, is a jealous God. It has always been God's plan that the whole world should know who he is. That the whole world should know that he is the only living God. So as with the believer today, when we look back over our lives and we see how good God has been, every now and then we need to take time to remember. Things we take so for granted that God has blessed us when he brings your children home safely. We've got to remember. When someone with even a less fatal disease than you dies and you still here, you've got to remember. Starving people all over the world, and you got a choice of what you want to eat. We need to remember. You've got to remember what God has done, has already done, and that's really the key to succeeding, even what you're currently waiting on him to do. Just remember how good God has already been in each of our lives. And I promise you, he's able to handle it. There's nothing too hard for him. There's nothing impossible for him. But all you've got to do is not focus on your problem, but just remember how good God has already been in your life.
What's the last significant challenge that you faced? You know, typically when I face a challenge of some kind, the questions that go through my head are something like, do I have what it takes? Can I do this? You know, what's the outcome going to be? Can I make it? Well, for 440 years now, God had been faithful to answer that question for the nation of Israel. And though he never put it in these words, his response was something like, no, you can't, but I can and I will. Over and over again, we saw him fight for and provide for his people. From 400 years being enslaved in Egypt, to when he parted the Red Sea, to the 40 years in the wilderness where he provided manna for them to eat, to the parting of the Jordan River for them to walk through to inherit the promised land. Time and time again, we saw God show up and provide for his people. When we stop to remember, it gives us confidence in what God will do. The greatest source of inspiration, the greatest source of encouragement comes from looking back at what he's already done, what he's carried you through. What's even more amazing about this is that it doesn't have to necessarily be something he's walked with you through. You know, if you've gone through a season of unemployment, hearing how God has provided and cared for somebody else gives you hope for what he might do for you. If you're walking through a season of grief or loss, God's word said he draws close to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit. Hearing someone's story about how God has drawn close to them and comforting them can give life to you. What current situation do you need to run through the filter of God's previous works? What are you facing today that maybe you need to see differently, or you need to speak to differently in light of the ways that God has worked in the past? I'm reminded of the way that David spoke to Goliath, or that David spoke to Saul as he faced Goliath. He said, the same God that delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from that Philistine. He was able to have faith, courage for today, be brave in light of what was coming his way because of the things that God had done in the past. He remembered those events. They were substance to him, gave him life for today. He could trust not in what he was capable of, but in who God was and what he was capable of to give him faith for what was